An emotional story of resilience, deeply moving. With a trembling voice, a child pleaded, "Open the coffin, please." From that moment on, a millionaire's life would never be the same. If you enjoy emotional stories, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're listening from. Continuing. It all started with a request that no one could have anticipated, delivered by a child whose tears were as real as the October wind cutting through the streets of Chicago. The girl, no more than 9 years old, stood at the entrance of Graceland Memorial Gardens, one of those elegant cemeteries where the wealthy lay their loved ones to rest beneath marble headstones and carefully trimmed hedges. She wore a simple black dress that seemed too big for her small frame, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. When she saw the man in the impeccable charcoal suit stepping out of the black sedan, she moved toward him with a determination that seemed impossible for someone so young. Michael Bradford had just arrived from New York, where he spent most of his time managing his investment firm and living a life that revolved around boardrooms, private jets, and penthouses with views of the skyline. He was 42 years old, successful beyond measure, and completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. He had barely made it in time for the service. In fact, he had missed most of it. The funeral had been rushed, organized in less than 48 hours, and when he had called his younger brother to ask why everything was happening so fast, the answers had been vague and unsatisfying. The girl approached him as he walked through the iron gates, her small hand reaching out to grab the sleeve of his coat. Michael stopped, startled, and looked down at her tear-streaked face. She was trembling, and her voice came out in a desperate whisper that seemed to carry the weight of something far greater than her years. "Please, sir," she said, her voice breaking. "You have to open the casket, please. Something is wrong." "I know something is wrong." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around, trying to locate the girl's parents, but everyone seemed to be walking away, dispersing into the parking lot, their faces blank and emotionless. The service had ended minutes before he arrived, and now the cemetery was emptying out like water draining from a sink. He crouched down to the girl's level, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "What are you talking about?" he asked gently, though his voice betrayed his confusion. "Who are you?" "I'm Sophie," she said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I'm your niece. My mom is your sister, Amanda. Grandma Eleanor was my grandmother too, and I know she's not supposed to be in there. Not like this, not yet." Michael's mind raced. He had a vague memory of his sister Amanda mentioning a daughter, but he had been so absent from family gatherings over the past decade that faces and names blurred together. He had built walls between himself and his family, walls made of distance and ambition and the quiet belief that success meant leaving the past behind. Now, standing in front of this child who was looking at him like he was her last hope, those walls felt flimsy and meaningless. "Sophie," he said slowly, trying to process what she was saying. "The doctors said your grandmother passed away. It was her heart. She was 73 years old. Sometimes these things happen and there's nothing we can do." But Sophie shook her head fiercely, her small hands balling into fists. No, that's not true. I was there. I was at the house the night before. Grandma was fine." She was laughing. "She made me hot chocolate and we watched a movie together. And then the next morning, Uncle Daniel said she was gone. But he wouldn't let me see her. He wouldn't let anyone see her. He said it was better to remember her the way she was. But that's not right. That's not how it works. You have to look. You have to make sure." Michael felt something twist in his chest, something between suspicion and dread. His younger brother Daniel had been the one to call him, the one to arrange everything, the one who had insisted that the funeral be held immediately, because of some regulation he had mentioned, but never fully explained. Daniel had always been the one who stayed close to home, the one who took care of their mother, after their father retreated into his own world of silence and regret. Michael had trusted him. He had trusted that Daniel would do the right thing, but now looking into Sophie's eyes, he wasn't so sure. "Where is your mother?" Michael asked, standing up and scanning the crowd again. "Where's Amanda?" "She left," Sophie said quietly. "She said she couldn't stay. She said it was too hard. But I heard her and Uncle Daniel arguing last night. She was yelling at him, saying something about papers and money and how he shouldn't have done it. And then she just stopped talking and walked away. Everyone just walked away. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked toward the gravesite, where workers were beginning to gather around the freshly dug plot, ready to lower the casket into the earth. His mother's casket. Eleanor Bradford, a woman who had raised 4 children, worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat after their father's business collapsed, and who had never asked for anything more than Sunday dinners and the occasional phone call. And now she was being buried in a hurry, with half the family missing and a child crying at the gates because something felt wrong. He pulled out his phone and called his brother. It rang 4 times before Daniel answered, his voice tight and clipped. "Michael, I told you the service started at 10. You missed it, I know. I got held up. But Daniel, I need to ask you something. Why was everything so rushed? Why didn't we wait?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Michael could hear traffic in the background, the sound of a car door closing. "Because that's what the doctors recommended," Daniel finally said. "Because Mom's wishes were to be laid to rest quickly. Because that's how it's done." "That's not an answer," Michael said, his voice hardening. "That's an excuse. And there's a little girl here telling me that something isn't right. She's saying Mom was fine the night before. She's saying you wouldn't let anyone see her." "Sophie is a child," Daniel snapped. "She doesn't understand these things. She's confused. She's grieving. We're all grieving, Michael. And maybe if you had been here more often you would understand that." The words stung, but Michael didn't back down. "I'm asking you to hold off on the burial. Just for a few hours. Let me see her. Let me make sure." There was another pause, and this time Michael could hear something else in his brother's voice. Fear. "It's too late," Daniel said quietly. "The paperwork is done. The permits are signed. It's happening, Michael. Let her rest." And then he hung up. Michael stood there, phone in hand, staring at the screen as the call ended. Sophie was still beside him, her small hand gripping his coat sleeve like a lifeline. He looked down at her, and then back at the grave site. The workers were moving the casket into position, preparing the straps and pulleys. In a matter of minutes, his mother would be lowered into the ground, and whatever truth lay inside that polished wooden box would be buried with her. He made a decision. "Stay here," he told Sophie. "Don't move." And then he walked toward the grave. The workers looked up as he approached, confused by the sudden interruption. Michael pulled out his wallet and removed a thick stack of bills, holding it out toward the supervisor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. "I need you to stop," Michael said. "Right now. Don't lower that casket." The supervisor frowned. "Sir, we have a schedule. The family has signed off on everything." "I'm family," Michael said. "I'm her son. And I'm telling you to stop." The man hesitated, glancing at his crew and then back at Michael. He could see the money in Michael's hand, enough to cover a month's wages and then some. But he could also see something else in Michael's eyes, something that made him pause. "You sure about this?" The supervisor asked. "Once we open it, there's no going back. You're going to see things you might not want to see." Michael nodded. "I'm sure." The supervisor sighed and motioned to his crew. "All right, but this is on you." They moved the casket back onto the platform and carefully unfastened the locks. Michael's heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might burst through his chest. He couldn't believe what he was doing. He couldn't believe that a child's plea had brought him to this moment, standing in a cemetery, demanding that his mother's casket be opened because something didn't feel right. But as the lid lifted and the interior was revealed, Michael understood why Sophie had begged him to look, because his mother's chest was moving. It was barely visible, a faint rise and fall beneath the pale blue dress she had been laid in, but it was there. Her skin was cold and waxy, her eyes closed, her hands folded neatly across her stomach. But she was breathing. Eleanor Bradford was alive. Michael's knees nearly gave out. He grabbed the edge of the casket to steady himself, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The supervisor cursed under his breath and immediately pulled out his phone, dialing for emergency services. One of the workers ran toward the cemetery office to get help. Sophie appeared at Michael's side, her face pale but her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and terror. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong." Michael couldn't speak. He could only stare at his mother, at the shallow movements of her chest, at the faint flutter of her eyelids. She looked like she was trapped in some terrible in-between place, not fully alive but not fully gone either. He reached out and touched her hand, and it was cold, so cold, but he could feel a pulse beneath the skin. Faint and slow, but there. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet of the cemetery like a knife. They pulled Eleanor from the casket with practiced efficiency, placing her on a stretcher and checking her vitals. One of them looked at Michael with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "How long has she been in there?" the paramedic demanded. "Since this morning," Michael said, his voice hollow. "They were about to bury her." The paramedic swore and turned back to his partner. "We need to move. Now." They loaded Eleanor into the ambulance and sped away, leaving Michael standing in the cemetery with Sophie at his side and a crowd of onlookers beginning to gather. News traveled fast in a place like this, and within the hour reporters would be arriving, cameras rolling, questions flying. The story would be everywhere by nightfall. A woman nearly buried alive in Chicago, a son who stopped the funeral just in time. A miracle, they would call it, but Michael knew better. This wasn't a miracle, this was something far darker. And as he looked down at Sophie, whose tear-streaked face now showed a glimmer of hope, he made a silent promise. He would find out what happened. He would find out who had done this to his mother, and he would make sure that the truth came to light, no matter how painful it might be. Because Eleanor Bradford deserved more than a shallow grave and a rushed goodbye. She deserved justice, and Michael was going to make sure she got it. The hospital room was sterile and cold, filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines and the antiseptic smell that seemed to cling to everything. Michael sat in a chair beside his mother's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin white blanket. She had been unconscious for nearly 12 hours since the paramedics had pulled her from the casket, and the doctors were calling it nothing short of extraordinary that she was alive at all. Extraordinary. That was the word they kept using, as if what had happened to Eleanor Bradford was some kind of beautiful accident, some twist of fate that deserved to be celebrated. But Michael knew better. He had spent the entire night pacing the hospital corridors, making phone calls, demanding answers, and piecing together a picture that was becoming clearer and more disturbing with every passing hour. The toxicology report had come back an hour ago, delivered by a young doctor with nervous hands and a voice that trembled when he spoke. Eleanor Bradford had been given a massive dose of sedatives, enough to suppress her heart rate and breathing to levels that mimicked clinical death. The doctor had explained it carefully, using terms like respiratory depression and induced coma, but the message was clear. Someone had drugged her. Someone had made her appear dead, and someone had nearly succeeded in burying her alive. Michael's hands clenched into fists as he stared at his mother's still face. She looked peaceful now, her features softened by sleep, but he couldn't stop imagining what it must have been like for her in those hours before Sophie had begged him to open the casket. Had she been aware? Had she felt the darkness closing in? Had she tried to scream and found that her body wouldn't respond? The door opened and his sister Amanda stepped inside. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She had been at the hospital since the early morning, alternating between sitting with their mother and avoiding the reporters who had gathered in the lobby like vultures waiting for fresh meat. The story had exploded across every news outlet in the city. Woman nearly buried alive in Chicago cemetery. Family drama unfolds as son halts funeral. The headlines were sensational and cruel, reducing their mother's suffering to clickbait. Amanda sat down in the chair next to Michael, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken accusations and shared grief. "I should have known," Amanda finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have seen it. Daniel was acting strange the whole week before. He kept saying Mom was tired, that she needed rest, that we shouldn't bother her. And then when he called to say she had passed, something just felt off. But I didn't push. I didn't ask the right questions. I just accepted it." Michael turned to look at her. "You argued with him, Sophie told me, the night before the funeral." Amanda nodded, her jaw tightening. "I confronted him about the insurance policy. I found out he had taken out a life insurance policy on Mom 6 months ago. $2 million, and he made himself the sole beneficiary. When I asked him why, he said it was just a precaution, that he wanted to make sure there was money for a proper funeral and to settle any debts. But Mom didn't have debts, Michael. She owned her house outright. She had savings. There was no reason for him to do that unless he was planning something. Michael felt a cold rage settle over him. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. His younger brother, the one who had stayed close to home, the one who had always been there for family dinners and holidays, had plotted to end their mother's life for money. Where is he now? Michael asked, his voice low and dangerous. I don't know, Amanda said. He hasn't answered his phone since yesterday. I went by his apartment this morning, but he wasn't there. His car is gone. I think he ran. Michael stood up, his mind racing. If Daniel had fled, it meant he knew the truth was coming out. It meant he was guilty, and he was trying to escape the consequences. But Michael wasn't going to let that happen. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for Detective Sarah Chen, the investigator who had been assigned to the case by the Chicago Police Department. She answered on the second ring. Bradford, I was just about to call you. We got the warrant to search your brother's apartment. We're heading over there now. I want to be there, Michael said. You know I can't let you do that, Detective Chen replied. This is an active investigation. You're too close to this. He's my brother, and that's my mother lying in a hospital bed because of what he did. I have a right to see what he was hiding. There was a pause, and then Chen sighed. All right, but you stay outside. You don't touch anything. You don't interfere. Understood? Understood. Michael ended the call and looked at Amanda. Stay with Mom. If she wakes up, call me immediately. Amanda nodded, her face pale but determined. Be careful, Michael. If Daniel is desperate enough to do this, there's no telling what else he might be capable of. Michael didn't respond. He simply walked out of the room, his mind focused on one thing and one thing only: finding the truth. Daniel's apartment was located in a modest building on the south side of Chicago, far from the wealth and luxury that Michael had grown accustomed to in New York. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with bare trees and cracked sidewalks, and as Michael pulled up in his rental car, he could see police vehicles already parked outside the building. Detective Chen was standing near the entrance talking to one of her officers, and when she saw Michael approaching, she held up a hand. Remember what I said. You stay outside. Michael nodded and leaned against the side of his car, watching as the officers entered the building. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about his brother, was being stripped away piece by piece, leaving behind something dark and unrecognizable. 20 minutes later, Detective Chen emerged from the building, carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a stack of documents, and even from a distance Michael could see his mother's name printed across the top of several pages. Chen walked over to him, her expression grim. We found what we were looking for. Insurance documents, forged medical records, receipts for large quantities of prescription sedatives purchased under a fake name. Your brother wasn't just planning this, Bradford. He was meticulous. He covered his tracks. If it hadn't been for that little girl and your decision to open the casket, no one would have ever known. Michael felt sick. He leaned forward, his hands bracing against the hood of the car, and tried to steady his breathing. How long? He asked. How long was he planning this? At least 6 months, Chen said. Maybe longer. The insurance policy was the first red flag. After that, he started isolating your mother, telling people she was unwell, discouraging visitors. He was setting the stage so that when she died, no one would question it. And it almost worked. Michael straightened up, his jaw clenched. What happens now? Now we find him. We've issued an arrest warrant. We've alerted airports, bus stations, border crossings. He won't get far. And when we find him, Chen said, her voice hard, he's going to answer for what he did. Attempted murder, fraud, forgery. He's looking at decades in prison. Michael nodded slowly. It should have felt like justice, but instead it just felt empty. His brother was a stranger now, a man capable of unthinkable cruelty, and no amount of punishment would erase what he had done. He drove back to the hospital in silence, the city passing by in a blur of grey buildings and cold autumn light. When he arrived, he found Amanda still sitting beside their mother's bed, but this time she wasn't alone. Their father, Richard Bradford, had arrived. He sat in the corner of the room, his face drawn and his eyes hollow. Richard had always been a distant figure in their lives, a man who had retreated into himself after his business failed and never fully emerged. He had loved his wife in his own quiet way, but he had never been strong enough to protect her from the world, or from the monsters that sometimes lived within their own family. Michael stood in the doorway, looking at the three of them, his mother still unconscious but alive, his sister exhausted but holding on, his father broken and silent. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "did you know?" Richard looked up, his eyes red and wet. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "But I should have. I should have seen it. Daniel came to me 2 months ago, asking me to sign some papers. He said they were for estate planning, to make things easier when the time came. I signed them without reading them. I trusted him. I trusted my own son, and I was wrong." Michael felt a wave of anger and pity wash over him. His father had always been weak, always chosen the easy path, the path of least resistance. But in this moment, Richard Bradford was finally facing the consequences of his choices, and the weight of it was crushing him. "We all trusted him," Michael said. That's what he counted on. Amanda stood up and walked over to the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Even if they catch Daniel, even if he goes to prison, how do we move forward from this? How do we look at each other and pretend this didn't happen?" "We don't pretend," Michael said. "We face it, we deal with it, and we make sure Mum knows that we're here for her no matter what." As if in response to his words, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. It was just for a moment, a brief crack of awareness before they closed again, but it was enough. Amanda gasped and rushed to her mother's side, taking her hand. "Mom? Mom, can you hear me?" Eleanor's lips moved, and a soft sound escaped, something between a sigh and a whisper. The machines around her beeped more rapidly, and a nurse hurried into the room to check her vitals. The nurse smiled, a genuine expression of relief. "She's waking up," the nurse said. "It's going to take time, but she's fighting her way back." Michael felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been coiled tight since the moment he saw his mother's chest rise and fall in that casket. She was alive. She was fighting. And he was going to make sure she had every chance to heal, to recover, to reclaim the life that had almost been stolen from her. Over the next few days, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her body slowly purging the drugs from her system. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, saying that despite the trauma, her organs were functioning and there didn't appear to be any permanent damage. But Michael knew that the real damage wasn't physical. It was the betrayal, the knowledge that her own son had tried to end her life. When Eleanor was finally stable enough to speak, Michael was the first person she asked for. He sat beside her bed, holding her frail hand, and looked into her eyes. They were still Eleanor's eyes, sharp and aware, but now they carried something new. A shadow, a wariness. "Michael," she said, her voice weak but steady, "tell me the truth. What happened?" And so he did. He told her everything. About the insurance policy, about the sedatives, about the rushed funeral and the casket, and Sophie's desperate plea. He told her about Daniel's disappearance and the police investigation and the evidence they had found. He left nothing out, no matter how painful it was to say or to hear. When he finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She simply stared at the ceiling, processing the enormity of what her son had done. "I raised him," she finally said. "I loved him. I sacrificed for him, and he tried to bury me alive." Michael squeezed her hand. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have been here. I should have seen it coming." Eleanor turned her head to look at him, and there was something fierce in her gaze. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters. And I'm not going to let this destroy me, Michael. I'm not going to let him win." And in that moment, Michael knew that his mother was going to survive this. Not just physically, but emotionally. She was stronger than any of them had realized. And together, they were going to make sure that the truth came out, and that justice was served. The decision came to Eleanor in the quiet hours of the night, when the hospital was still, and the only sounds were the soft footsteps of nurses in the hallway and the steady rhythm of the machines monitoring her heartbeat. She had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over the pieces of what had happened to her, like fragments of broken glass. Each memory that surfaced was sharp and painful. The taste of something bitter in her evening tea, the sensation of her body growing heavy, her limbs refusing to obey her commands. The suffocating darkness that had followed, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. But more than the physical memories, it was the emotional ones that cut the deepest. Daniel's face smiling at her as he handed her the cup of tea, his voice soft and reassuring, telling her to rest, that everything would be all right. The way he had kissed her forehead before leaving the room, a gesture she had interpreted as love, but now understood as something else entirely. Goodbye. Eleanor's hands trembled as she pressed them against the blanket. She wanted to scream. She wanted to rage against the universe for allowing her own child to become a monster. But she didn't. Instead, she made a choice that would shape everything that followed. She would pretend. When the morning came and the doctors arrived to check on her progress, Eleanor greeted them with confusion in her eyes. She answered their questions slowly, as if each word required immense effort. She claimed that her memories were fragmented, that she couldn't remember much about the days leading up to her collapse. She told them that faces were blurry, that names escaped her, that the world felt like something she was seeing through frosted glass. The doctors exchanged glances and made notes on their charts. Memory loss was common in cases of severe trauma and drug overdose, they explained to Michael and Amanda. It could be temporary or it could last longer. The brain needed time to heal, just like the body. Michael accepted the explanation, though Eleanor could see the worry in his eyes. Amanda believed it without question, her relief evident in the way her shoulders relaxed. Richard said nothing, but then again Richard rarely did. He simply sat in the corner of the room, a silent witness to the wreckage of their family. Only Eleanor knew the truth. Her memory was intact. Every moment, every detail, every betrayal was etched into her mind with cruel clarity. But she needed time. She needed to observe. She needed to see who among her family could be trusted, and who might still be hiding secrets. Because if Daniel had been capable of such a thing, who else might have known? Who else might have looked the other way? Detective Chen visited the hospital 3 days after Eleanor woke up. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Eleanor immediately respected. Chen pulled a chair close to the bed and spoke in a voice that was both gentle and direct. "Mrs. Bradford, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about the days before your collapse. Anything you can remember might help us build a stronger case against your son." Eleanor looked at her, with what she hoped was convincing confusion. "I'm sorry, Detective. I wish I could help. But it's all so foggy. I remember bits and pieces, but nothing that makes sense." Chen nodded, her expression patient. "That's all right. Sometimes memories come back gradually. If anything surfaces, no matter how small, I want you to contact me immediately." She handed Eleanor a business card, and Eleanor took it with shaking hands. She felt a pang of guilt for misleading the detective, but she pushed it aside. This was necessary. She had to know the full extent of what had been done to her, and by whom. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor was transferred from the hospital to a rehabilitation center on the outskirts of Chicago. It was a quiet place, surrounded by trees that were shedding their autumn leaves, and the staff were kind and attentive. Michael visited every day, often bringing Sophie with him. The little girl would sit beside Eleanor's bed and tell her stories about school, about her friends, about the stray cat she had found in the alley behind her apartment. Sophie's presence was a balm, a reminder that not everything in the world was cruel and calculating. Amanda came less frequently, her time divided between her job and her own struggles to process what had happened. But when she did visit, she brought flowers and sat quietly, sometimes reading aloud from books she thought Eleanor might enjoy. Richard came only once. He stood in the doorway, unable to meet Eleanor's eyes, and mumbled something about needing to take care of things at home. Eleanor watched him leave and felt nothing. The man she had married, the man she had built a life with, was a ghost. He had been for years. But it was Daniel's absence that haunted her most. He had been captured 4 days after Eleanor woke up, found in a motel outside of St. Louis, with a duffel bag full of cash and a one-way ticket to Mexico. The arrest had made national news, and the footage of him being led away in handcuffs played on a loop across every major outlet. Eleanor had watched it from her hospital bed, her heart breaking and hardening at the same time. Now, as she sat in the rehabilitation center, she knew that Daniel would eventually try to reach out. Men like him always did. They needed to justify themselves, to explain their actions, to seek forgiveness or understanding or some twisted form of absolution. And when he did, Eleanor would be ready. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. One of the nurses approached Eleanor with a hesitant expression and told her that there was someone on the phone who wanted to speak with her. A young man claiming to be her son. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her face calm. "Put him through," she said quietly. The nurse handed her the cordless phone, and Eleanor held it to her ear. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Daniel's voice came through, thin and strained. "Mom? Mom, is that you?" Eleanor closed her eyes. "Yes, Daniel. It's me." She heard him exhale, a shaky breath that might have been relief or fear or both. "I'm so glad you're okay. I've been so worried. I heard what happened and I just needed to know you were all right." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to tell him that she knew everything. But she didn't. She kept her voice soft and confused. "Daniel, I don't understand what's happening. The doctors say I had some kind of episode. They say I was very sick, but I don't remember much. Can you help me understand?" There was a pause, and Eleanor could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. He was trying to decide how much to say, how much to reveal. "Mom, you were sick," he said slowly. "Your heart. The doctors said it was your heart. I tried to get you help, but it all happened so fast. And then Michael showed up and made all these accusations, and everything got twisted around. But I swear I was just trying to take care of you." Eleanor felt a cold fury settle over her. He was lying. Even now, with the evidence stacked against him, with the police breathing down his neck, he was lying. "I believe you," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "I know you love me, Daniel. I know you would never hurt me." She could hear the relief in his voice when he responded. "Thank you, Mom, thank you. I knew you would understand. Michael doesn't get it. He's been gone so long, he doesn't know how hard things have been. But you do. You've always understood me." Eleanor's stomach turned. "Tell me, Daniel. Tell me what happened. Help me remember," and so he did. Over the next 30 minutes, Daniel spun a story that was equal parts truth and fiction. He talked about how stressed he had been, how he had borrowed money from the wrong people, how the debts had piled up until he couldn't see a way out. He talked about the insurance policy, but he framed it as a safety net, something to protect the family. He admitted to giving Eleanor something to help her sleep, but he claimed it was just a mild sedative, nothing dangerous. He never once admitted to trying to end her life. He never once took full responsibility. Instead, he painted himself as a victim of circumstance, a man who had made mistakes but whose intentions had been good. Eleanor listened to every word, her mind cataloguing each lie, each evasion, each moment of manipulation. And when he was finished, she said exactly what he needed to hear. "I forgive you, Daniel." She could hear him crying on the other end of the line, sobbing with relief. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much. I'll make this right. I promise. I'll fix everything." Eleanor ended the call and handed the phone back to the nurse. Her hands were shaking, but not from weakness, from rage. Michael arrived an hour later, and Eleanor told him everything. She told him about the phone call, about Daniel's confession disguised as an explanation, about the careful way he had tried to manipulate her even from behind bars. And then she told Michael about the plan she had been forming, the plan that would ensure Daniel faced the full consequences of his actions. "We need a confession," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "A real one. Not the half-truths he feeds to people. We need him to admit what he did on record, in a way that can be used in court." Michael leaned forward, his eyes intent. "How do we do that?" Eleanor smiled, and it was a smile that carried no warmth. "We give him what he wants, hope. We make him think that I believe him, that I'm on his side, that there's a way out of this. And when he's comfortable, when he thinks he's safe, we get him to tell the truth." Over the next 3 weeks, Eleanor played her part perfectly. She accepted more phone calls from Daniel, each one recorded with the cooperation of Detective Chen and the district attorney's office. She told him that she was working on getting the charges reduced, that she was speaking to lawyers, that she believed in him. She fed him the illusion of safety, and he clung to it like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. And then, on a cold November evening, Eleanor agreed to meet with him. It was a supervised visit at the county jail, with Michael, Amanda, and Detective Chen. hidden in an observation room watching through a one-way mirror. Eleanor sat across from her son, separated by a thick pane of glass, and picked up the phone that connected them. Daniel looked terrible. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But when he saw Eleanor, his face lit up with something that might have been genuine relief. "Mom, I'm so glad you came. I've missed you so much." "I've missed you too, Daniel," Eleanor said softly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. About the stress you were under, about the debts, about the mistakes you made." Daniel nodded eagerly. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I never wanted any of this to happen. I just didn't know what else to do." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Daniel, I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest. Because if I'm going to help you, I need to know the whole truth. What really happened that night? What did you give me?" Daniel's expression faltered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But then he seemed to steel himself and the words came tumbling out. "I gave you the sedatives," he said quietly. "A lot of them. Enough to slow your heart down, to make it look like you had passed. I thought it would be painless. I thought you would just slip away and never know. And then I could collect the insurance money, pay off the debts, and no one would ever have to know." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "And the funeral. The rush to bury me. I paid off the funeral director," Daniel admitted. "I told him it was what you wanted, a quick and private service. I forged your signature on the documents. I made sure no one would ask too many questions. It was supposed to be over before anyone could stop it." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the weight of his confession settle over her. "And if Michael hadn't opened the casket, if no one had checked, then you would have died," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "And I would have lived with it for the rest of my life. But I didn't have a choice, Mom. I didn't have a choice." Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at her son, really looked at him. And what she saw wasn't a monster. It was a weak, desperate man who had made the worst possible choice and now couldn't face the consequences. "There's always a choice, Daniel," she said quietly. "Always." And then she hung up the phone and walked out of the room. Detective Chen met her in the hallway, her expression grim but satisfied. "We got it, Mrs. Bradford, every word. That confession is going to put him away for a very long time." Eleanor nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. "Good," she said, "because he needs to understand that actions have consequences, and I need to know that no one else will ever have to go through what I went through." Michael stepped out of the observation room and wrapped his arms around his mother, holding her tightly. "You were so brave," he said. "I'm so proud of you." Eleanor rested her head against his chest and allowed herself to cry. Not for Daniel, not for the son she had lost, but for herself, for the woman who had been betrayed in the most profound way possible and who had found the strength to fight back. The courtroom was packed on the day of Daniel Bradford's trial. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras and notebooks ready to capture every moment of what had become one of the most sensational cases in Chicago's recent history. The public gallery was filled with curious onlookers, people who had followed the story from the beginning and now wanted to see how it would end. But in the front row, separated from the chaos by a low wooden barrier, sat the Bradford family. Eleanor, Michael, Amanda, and even Richard, each of them carrying the weight of what they were about to witness. Eleanor wore a simple navy dress and had her grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked composed, dignified, but Michael could see the tension in the way she held her hands folded tightly in her lap. This was the moment she had been working toward for months, the moment when the truth would be laid bare for everyone to see, and yet he knew that no verdict, no sentence, could ever truly undo what had been done to her. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone rose as Judge Patricia Alvarez entered and took her seat at the bench. She was a stern woman in her 60s, known for her fairness and her intolerance for deception. The charges against Daniel were read aloud, each one a hammer blow. Attempted murder, fraud, forgery, insurance fraud, conspiracy. The list went on, and with each charge, Daniel seemed to shrink a little more in his seat at the defense table. He had tried to plead not guilty at first, claiming that the confession Eleanor had recorded was coerced, that he had been in an unstable mental state, that he deserved leniency. But the evidence was overwhelming. The toxicology reports, the forged documents, the insurance policy with Daniel as the sole beneficiary, the testimony of the funeral director, who admitted to being paid to rush the burial without proper procedures, and most damning of all, the recording of Daniel's own voice, admitting to everything. The prosecution presented their case with clinical precision, building a narrative that left no room for doubt. They called medical experts who explained how the sedatives had been administered and the effects they had on Eleanor's body. They called forensic accountants who traced Daniel's debts and his financial desperation. They called witnesses who testified to his behavior in the weeks leading up to Eleanor's collapse. How he had isolated her, controlled her access to visitors, and created a narrative of declining health that wasn't real. And then they called Eleanor to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she made her way to the witness box, her steps slow but steady. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and then she sat down and looked directly at the jury. For a long moment she didn't speak. She simply let them see her, this woman who had survived the unthinkable, and let the reality of what had been done to her sink in. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Martinez, approached with a gentle expression. "Mrs. Bradford, can you tell the court in your own words what happened on the night of September 14th? Eleanor took a breath and began to speak. Her voice was clear and strong, and as she recounted the events of that night, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She described the tea Daniel had given her, the strange bitterness she had tasted but dismissed. She described the heaviness that had crept through her limbs, the way her vision had blurred, and her thoughts had become sluggish. She described the moment she realized something was terribly wrong, but by then it was too late. Her body wouldn't respond. She couldn't call for help. She couldn't fight back. And then there was darkness, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly, a darkness so complete that I thought it was death. I thought I was dying. And in a way I was. My son had decided that my life was worth less than the money he could gain from my death. And he nearly succeeded. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the reporters, hardened by years of covering tragedy, looked visibly shaken. The jury watched Eleanor with a mixture of sympathy and anger, and when the prosecutor asked her final question, Eleanor's answer was simple and devastating. "Do you believe your son intended to end your life?" Eleanor looked across the courtroom at Daniel, who sat with his head bowed, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes," she said quietly, "I believe he did." The defense tried to argue that Daniel had been suffering from extreme stress, that his judgment had been impaired, that he deserved a second chance. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence and the quiet dignity of Eleanor's testimony. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Daniel's face crumpled as the verdict was read, and he turned to look at his mother one last time. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. This was justice. It was painful and imperfect, but it was justice nonetheless. 2 weeks later, Daniel was sentenced to 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20. Judge Alvarez delivered the sentence with a stern voice, noting that while she recognized Daniel's remorse, the severity of his actions demanded significant consequences. "You betrayed the most sacred bond that exists," she said, looking directly at him. "The bond between a parent and a child, and you did so for money. There is no excuse for that. No justification. You will serve your time, and you will live with what you've done for the rest of your life." As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, Eleanor felt a strange sense of closure wash over her. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was simply the knowledge that this chapter of her life was finally coming to an end. But endings, Eleanor had learned, were also beginnings. In the months that followed, Eleanor threw herself into healing, both physically and emotionally. She attended therapy sessions twice a week, working through the trauma with a patient counselor who helped her process the betrayal and the fear. She reconnected with old friends, people she had lost touch with over the years, and found comfort in their support. And most importantly, she decided to turn her pain into something meaningful. 6 months after the trial, Eleanor founded an organization called Second Chances, dedicated to supporting survivors of family violence and manipulation. She rented a small office space in downtown Chicago and worked with a team of volunteers to create resources for people who had been betrayed by those they trusted most. The organization offered counseling, legal assistance, and a safe space for survivors to share their stories and find strength in community. Eleanor became a voice for the voiceless, speaking at conferences and community events about the realities of family trauma and the importance of breaking the silence. She was honest about her own experience, never shying away from the difficult details, and her authenticity resonated with people. Letters poured in from across the country, from men and women who had survived similar situations and found hope in Eleanor's story. Michael moved back to Chicago permanently, selling his penthouse in New York and buying a house just a few blocks from his mother's. He scaled back his work with the investment firm, delegating more responsibilities so he could spend time with Eleanor and Sophie. He realized that all the money and success in the world meant nothing if he didn't have the people he loved close by. And he had wasted too many years chasing things that didn't matter. Amanda also began to heal, though her journey was different. She enrolled in school to become a social worker, inspired by her mother's advocacy work. She wanted to help families before they reached a breaking point, to identify the warning signs and intervene before tragedy struck. It was her way of making sense of what had happened, of turning the pain into purpose. Richard, however, never fully recovered. The guilt of his inaction, of his willingness to look the other way, consumed him. He attended a few therapy sessions, but found it difficult to confront his own role in what had happened. Eventually, he moved to a small town in Wisconsin, seeking solitude and distance from the memories that haunted him. Eleanor wished him well, but accepted that some wounds were too deep to heal. 2 years after the trial, on a cold January morning, Eleanor received a letter. It was postmarked from the state penitentiary, where Daniel was serving his sentence, and the handwriting on the envelope was familiar. She held it in her hands for a long time before opening it, unsure if she was ready to read what was inside. But when she finally unfolded the pages, she found something she hadn't expected. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness or an attempt to justify his actions. It was simply an apology, a raw, honest acknowledgement of the harm he had caused and the pain he had inflicted. Daniel wrote about his time in prison, about the therapy he was receiving, about the slow and difficult process of facing what he had done. He didn't ask for anything. He simply wanted her to know that he was trying to become a better person, even if it was too late to undo the past. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, and each time she felt a different emotion: anger, sadness, and finally, something that resembled peace. She knew that forgiveness wasn't something she owed to Daniel. It wasn't a gift she had to give. But she also knew that holding on to hatred would only poison her own life, and she had come too far to let that happen. A week later, Eleanor made the decision to visit Daniel in prison. Michael tried to talk her out of it, worried that seeing him would set back her progress, but Eleanor was firm. "This is something I need to do," she told him. "Not for him, for me." The prison was a cold, sterile place, all concrete walls and fluorescent lights. Eleanor sat in the visiting room, waiting as Daniel was brought in. He looked different now, older, thinner. The arrogance and desperation that had once defined him were gone, replaced by something quieter and more subdued. They sat across from each other, separated by a table and a lifetime of broken trust. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor broke the silence. "I got your letter," she said. Daniel nodded, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't sure if you would." "I almost didn't," Eleanor admitted, "but I realized that I needed to see you. Not to absolve you. Not to tell you that everything is okay, but to tell you that I forgive you." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at the table. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," Eleanor said gently. "You don't. But forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I need. And I need to let go of the anger and the pain so I can move forward with my life. You took so much from me, Daniel, but you don't get to take my future." Daniel wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm so sorry." Eleanor stood up, preparing to leave. "I know you are," she said, "and I hope that someday you can forgive yourself, because carrying that weight for the rest of your life won't bring either of us peace." She walked out of the prison and into the cold winter air, feeling lighter than she had in years. The forgiveness she had offered wasn't for Daniel. It was for herself. It was the final step in reclaiming her life, in refusing to let what he had done define her. Life continued as it always does. Eleanor's organization grew, helping hundreds of survivors find their voices and their strength. Michael became deeply involved in the work, using his business skills to secure funding and expand their reach. Amanda graduated with her degree and began working with at-risk families, making a real difference in the lives of people who needed it most. And Sophie, now a confident and compassionate young woman, volunteered at Second Chances during her school breaks, inspired by the grandmother who had survived the impossible. Eleanor never forgot what had been done to her. The scars, both physical and emotional, would always be there, but she refused to let them define her. She had been buried alive in the most literal sense, and she had clawed her way back to the surface. She had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, and she had proven that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, the human spirit could endure. On the third anniversary of the day she had been pulled from that casket, Eleanor stood in front of a crowd at a community center in Chicago, sharing her story with a room full of survivors. She spoke about the importance of breaking the silence, of refusing to be a victim, of finding strength in community and purpose in pain. And when she finished, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Michael watched from the back of the room, tears streaming down his face. His mother, the woman who had been left for dead, was now a beacon of hope for so many others. And he knew without a doubt that her survival hadn't been a miracle. It had been a testament to her strength, her courage, and her refusal to give up. That night, as Eleanor sat in her living room with Michael and Sophie, sipping tea and talking about the day, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Not happiness, exactly, because happiness felt too simple for everything she had been through, but contentment, peace, the knowledge that she had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into something meaningful. The grave had not claimed her. The darkness had not won, and every day that she woke up, every breath that she took was a victory.